The previous episode ended with Rose leaving Theodore with Iris. At that moment, Theodore called out to her, but she didn't respond and continued on her way. Then she hid behind a wall and smiled, saying to herself, "Was this the right choice?" Meanwhile, the carriage left, and Theodore felt sad. Iris looked at him shyly and said, "Prince Theodore, are you all right?" Theodore smiled and said, "I'm sorry." She replied, "It's okay." At that time, Rose was walking down an alley and felt nervous when she heard a beggar say, "That dress is very expensive." They began to look at her and laugh, saying, "Where are you from, princess? Do us a favor and pay up." Nervously, Rose said to them, "Can you move? I'm in a hurry." When she passed them, one of them took her bag and said, "You can't talk to the poor, can you?" Shocked by his reaction, she said, "Stop!" But he looked at her lustfully and said, "Come to my bed and see how life goes in the poor neighborhood, sweetie." She closed her eyes nervously just as the beggar was about to grab her, when her servant, Olivier, arrived and grabbed his hands tightly, saying, "What problem did you have with Madame Charliel? You can discuss it with me. I am a servant of the Charliel family." When Rose saw him, she blushed and called out his name, "Olivier." At that moment, the beggar said to the others, "No time for flirting now. Let's get out of here." And they left immediately. So, Rose sighed in relief. Olivier asked her, "Did they hurt you?" She said, "No, I'm fine." Olivier sighed and said, "I heard you got out of Theodore's carriage. Why would you do something like that?" Rose replied, "I just wanted to get some fresh air." But Olivier said, "You're a lady from the Charliel family, aren't you? It's dangerous to be alone." With a sad look, she said, "I'm sorry." Olivier said, "I'll carry your things so we can go back to the palace." But Rose asked, "You won't scold me?" He looked at her and said, "Oh, I'll get all the details about this later." After they returned to the palace, Rose said to him with a sad face, "To be honest, I'm planning to break off my engagement to Prince Theodore." This surprised Olivier. He poured her some tea and asked, "Okay, why did you make this decision?" Rose thought to herself, "The bad ending and avoiding the death of the prince and me, but I can't say that. Moreover, I can't say that I'm the only one who deserves this marriage." Then she said to him, "The engagement is to help the Charliel family, and it's just politics, isn't it? And since Prince Theodore has become more attracted to Iris than me, I decided to break off the engagement." The servant asked her nervously, "What did the prince say?" She replied, "We decided to end it in a way that preserves the reputation of both families. He simply respects my decision." Olivier was silent for a moment, then said to her, "I understand your feelings, miss. Nevertheless, well, as your servant, I will do everything in my power to help you." Rose was astonished by his words and looked at him, thinking to herself, "Olivier, what is he thinking of doing?" The next morning, Olivier drove her to the university and helped her out of the carriage, saying, "Be careful, miss." She politely said, "Thank you." At the same time, Theodore arrived and told his servant, "All right, I'm going." When Olivier noticed him, he thought to himself, "That is Prince Theodore." So he turned back to Rose and said, "Miss." Rose said, "Olivier, what's wrong?" As he turned to her, he placed his hands on her hair and said, "Your hair is out of place." Rose nervously said, "Olivier." She then turned her face away and said shyly, "You usually don't do things like that." Olivier hushed her and whispered, "I wonder if Prince Theodore is really more attracted to Iris than you. As a servant of the Charliel family, I must get to the bottom of this matter." Theodore noticed them and said, "Huh? Is that Miss Rose?" At that moment, Rose was telling her servant, "There's no need to do that." But Olivier said to her, "I don't mean anything bad by it. Just pretend to agree." Suddenly, Olivier put his hands on her face, so she asked in surprise, "What?" Suddenly, he kissed her on the cheek to see Theodore's reaction when he saw it. And indeed, Theodore was astonished by what he saw, as was Rose. She said to him shyly, "Olivier, "What are you doing?" So Olivier smiled and said, "I have my strategies too, Miss Rose." She said shyly, "Strategies?" When she turned around and saw him, she noticed that Theodore had been watching all this time. So, nervously and shyly, she said, "Prince Theodore, this," but he smiled as if nothing had happened and didn't care, saying, "Good morning, Miss Rose. Don't be late for class." She said to herself in surprise, "That's all?" She remembered when he kissed a strand of her hair, saying, "He kissed my hair during the horseback riding trip." So she said sadly, "What am I thinking? I know I shouldn't expect anything from him, but the scene changes to a break time." Olivier had prepared a teapot of tea for Rose when a girl came to her and said, "Miss Rose, who is that young man?" Rose looked at her and smiled, saying, "He's my servant. Just consider him someone who takes care of my things, okay? Because he's much more efficient, isn't he?" Then she thought to herself, "I think I've deceived everyone, but Olivier followed me to school against my wishes. And that kiss this morning, what's wrong with Olivier?" Olivier brought the tea to everyone and smiled, saying, "Everyone, I'm sorry to be such a nuisance, but I just made a pot of tea. Please have some." The girls went to him and said, "You're not a nuisance at all. We love skilled servants like you." "So he's Miss Rose's servant?" Suddenly, one of the young men said, "All the girls are swarming around him." Olivier suddenly went to Rose and whispered, "Miss, it's impolite to hold your cup with both hands." She said to him, "I know that." Suddenly, one of the young men said, "Those two are really close, aren't they?" Someone told me they were joking around earlier. Theodore was just listening to them in silence. The scene then changes to a dance time. One of the attendees was teaching Rose to dance and said, "1, 2, 3, excellent work, Miss Rose, your dance is perfect." Rose said, "I love dancing." Then this girl said, "Someone, we need a partner for Miss Rose." The others started whispering, saying, "A partner for Miss Rose? If you step on her foot, you might be executed." Theodore raised his hand to dance with Rose, but Olivier interrupted and said, "If no one wants to dance with her, I will be enough to offer my hand." Rose said nervously, "I thought you were just an observer, Olivier." The dance instructor said, "Great idea. I'd love to see you two dance after they danced," she said in amazement. "Just as I expected, perfect harmony. I can tell they've been together since they were children." Suddenly, when Rose turned around, she noticed that Theodore was staring at them. She thought to herself, "The look I'm getting from Prince Theodore is scary." After class ended, she thought to herself, "That was another long day." Suddenly, Theodore went to her and said, "Miss Rose, I have something I'd like to tell you. May I have a minute of your time?" Rose thought nervously. "I have a really bad feeling about this." When she went with him, she said, "So, what is it? What do you want to say?" Theodore said to her, "You're a smart woman. There's no way you can be blind to what's happening, is there?" Rose said, "Yes, I know what's happening. You're talking about my servant, aren't you?" Theodore put his hands on his head and said, "It's true that I started talking about ending the engagement, but you're still engaged to me. Our reputation will suffer if any man gets close to you, even your servant." Rose felt nervous and said, "I'm sorry, but my servant forced me to do it." Theodore suddenly yelled at her, "You're a lady from the Charliel family, aren't you? Are you saying you can't stop just one servant?" Suddenly, when he woke up and realized he shouldn't do that, he turned away and said to her, "I apologize. I said too much." Rose nervously said, "What's wrong?" Theodore said, "Somehow this isn't like you. If my reaction seems strange to you, it's because of you and no one else. And even more so, your servant," Rose said nervously. "But he used to pick me up and drop me off from school and sometimes comes to the academy campus." But she suddenly remembered when Olivier kissed her on the cheek and thought to herself, "This means the thing that's bothering the prince is the kiss Olivier gave me this morning." She felt embarrassed and put her hand on her cheek. So Theodore suddenly grabbed her hand and asked, "What are you thinking about? Am I the only victim here?" Rose looked at him shyly and said, "Prince Theodore." Suddenly their servant Olivier entered. When he saw Theodore holding Rose's hand, he said, What's this? I could hear your voices from outside. Rose said nervously, Olivier? But Olivier said to Theodore, There's nothing to worry about, is there, your highnesses? Theodore looked at Olivier in silence, so Olivier said, Your Highness. Theodore snapped out of it and let go of Rose's hand, saying, I'm sorry. That's all I had to say. Then he left immediately. Rose called after him shyly, Prince Theodore? The next morning, Olivier was in the carriage with Rose and was saying to her, Today you have foreign language and rhetoric classes and your private piano lesson at the palace this afternoon, so I'll pick you up from the university. But Rose wasn't listening to him because she was thinking and saying, like Prince Theodore was yesterday. What happened to him? She remembered when he said to her, What are you thinking about? Am I the only victim here? Suddenly, Olivier said to her, Miss, are you thinking about Theodore again? So she turned her face away shyly and thought to herself, How does he know that? Then she turned to him and said, Prince Theodore was upset. He said that you and I get too close in front of others. Olivier smiled and said to her, He's not just upset, you know. He's also jealous. And it's exactly as I expected. There's no way he could have chosen Iris over you. Theodore is longing for you, miss.